Good morning. I'm Donna Shank. I'm, as you heard earlier, Vice Chair of the Kansas Health Foundation Board of Directors. Yesterday, you all heard about some of the challenges and the opportunities facing our state with regards to education, diversity, and demographics. But I think we can all agree, as Chase mentioned earlier, that just having information or knowledge is not enough. We have to take action. We have to be interested, engaged, and active participants in our organizations, our communities, and our state. That's why it's such an honor to have today speaking with us a man who has literally, and I mean literally, written the book on citizen engagement. Eric Liu is the CEO of Citizen University, which promotes and teaches the art of powerful citizenship. He is the author of multiple best-selling books, including his latest, You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. A much sought-after speaker, Eric is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law and served as a White House speechwriter and domestic policy advisor to President Bill Clinton. He writes columns for national publications, makes appearances on national TV broadcasts, and best of all, he's the kickoff speaker for our second day of this symposium. Please welcome Eric Liu.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Donna, and I want to thank all of you for this warm welcome. It's just great to be here this morning and to be kicking off the second day of this symposium. I arrived last night, but I've been following on Twitter all that you were doing yesterday, and I was sorry to miss my friend Maria Hinojosa, who was with you yesterday, who is just, as you know, fantastic, and but also sorry to miss just some of the data. Actually, I know that there is a lot, and even flipping through the book that you've gotten this morning, there's a lot to digest. But I think when you look across all of these data points, and this is second nature to many of the people in this room, patterns emerge. And the patterns are somewhat the patterns that are named in those books or talked about in comments like this. But I think the patterns are also something that all of us who care about health and civic health feel in our bones. It's nice to have some actual quantified validation of what we feel in our bones, but we live in a time right now where there's so much pain in our country. There's so much anxiety in our society. And though it is wonderful to have that in data form, I'm also a believer that in civic life right now, actually, in American society in general, we sometimes labor under the tyranny of the measurable. And we forget what it means actually to feel each other, and what it means to actually trust our gut and our intuition about what we're feeling in our bones and in our heart about what the shape and the course of our community and our society is. And so this is a room of people who have that gut and heart activated as much as the data-minded head, and I really appreciate that. I want to say a word about the work that we do at Citizen University as a way to kind of frame up some lessons that we've learned along the way in our work about trying to foster a culture of powerful citizenship. So Citizen University, we're a nonprofit. We're based in Seattle, where I'm from, but we do work all around the United States. And as Donna said, our mission is really to foster a culture and the practice powerful citizenship. I should say a couple of just definitional notes. When I talk about citizenship and Citizen University and so forth, our work is in the United States, and we focus very much on what it means to be in America right now. But when I talk about the word citizen in this context, I'm not talking only about documentation status under our immigration laws. I mean citizen in the kind of broader ethical sense when we talk about someone being a good citizen or a not so good citizen, this kind of capacious ethical sense of being a member of the body, right? A contributor to community, someone who really sees their fate as entwined with the fate of others. And our belief in general is that that work of practicing citizenship is a practice. Right? It's not simply a matter of you are or you're not, or you have it or you don't. It is a matter of understanding that there are values to be cultivated, there is knowledge to be gained, and there are skills to be practiced over and over again that make one effective and powerful as a participant in civic life. At the heart of so much of what we do is this recognition that though this work matters all the time, and it has mattered since the beginning of the Republic, it matters particularly today. And again, we're starting day 2, and so a lot of day 1, I know, was setting up for you why this time is a time of crisis. And I think we can feel it on many levels, but it's actually rather interesting to think about the ways in which physical health and civic health entwine. The body and the body politic, right, are facing the same kinds of things. We're living in an age of nearly unprecedented inequality, nearly unprecedented concentration of wealth, and the modifier nearly is the closest we've come to it was right before the Great Depression. This is one of those instances where its correlation may in fact be causation, right? That when you have the levels of inequality and concentration of wealth and income and opportunity and voice that you have today and that we had in the 1920s and 1930s, the system tends to start to tip over. When you have a metaphor I sometimes use, we're in a state right now where the wealthiest 1% of Americans in 1980 accounted for about 8% of the nation's income. And today, that same 1% account for nearly 24% of the nation's income. Right? So if we just imagine, again, back to the metaphor of the body and the body politic, if we imagine that 24% of my blood supply was in my pinky, right? What would it be like? My pinky would feel like it was doing great, for a while at least, but it would actually not notice that it was down on the ground because it was bulging and full of blood while the rest of me was collapsed on the ground, barely able to breathe or move. Right? When you have a quarter of the blood supply in 1% of the body starts to fail. And when you have that kind of concentration, again, this is something we feel in our bones. We feel it in economic life, we feel it in political life, and we feel it not just when it comes to questions of Medicaid expansion, for instance, or school funding, policy issues where in a time of this kind of concentration, people get into a very zero-sum mindset. If someone's going to get more, that must mean I'm going to get less, and so I don't want them to get more, right? But we also feel it in the way in which, in general, not even in policy questions, the scarcity mindset starts to seep into everything we do, everything we are. Right? This feeling of status anxiety, of how am I, not just am I keeping up with the Joneses, but am I stuck and am I being left behind? And that is, again, both a literal and metaphorical notion, being left behind. The data that you've talked about yesterday, that you see again codified in this booklet today, are about the ways in which Kansas and all across the United States, the population over the course of the next generation is going to be moving to cities. And the urban counties and communities are going to be growing in power and numbers and diversity and robustness, while the rural communities lose people and lifeblood and life force. Right? That is very pertinent here in Kansas, but it's not just Kansas, it's all around the country. And that sense of being left behind is one measure of it is the urban-rural divide. But even within a city, I come from Seattle right now, where many places around the country would love to have the problems we're having in Seattle. Seattle is booming out of control. Thanks to Amazon and others, we've added over 115,000 people in the last decade. Amazon alone hired 40 or 50,000 of those people. And with that boom of population has come prosperity, but has also come traffic, rising housing prices, and an unbelievable homelessness crisis that is burgeoning out of control in Seattle and King County, right? But even within the confines of Seattle, which is a prosperous town, undergoing a boom of the kind that Seattle experienced during the gold rush, and again when our friends at Boeing started to figure out the aviation business. But right now, even in that context, which is just an urban context, there is this scarcity mentality. There is this zero-sum feeling. There's this feeling if someone's going to get something, then I got to tear them down. And there's this fear that permeates politics, so that when we try to address, for instance, the homelessness crisis in Seattle, there is a narrowing of our mindset. There is a closing of our heart. And there's this sense that I don't want to pay more taxes to help the homeless. Let them move. There's a lot of other places to live. I don't want to tax big business. If I'm a big business, I don't want to pay more taxes, right? And that narrative, even within bright blue, liberal, urban Seattle, little bubble that it is evidence that this scarcity mindset, this feeling of zero-sumness, is all around us, right? And that feeling is something that I think is exacerbated by the other set of trends and shifts that you all have spent time talking about, and that is the deep demographic shifts that are tectonic shifts in our country right now. I know Maria and Manuel Pastor yesterday were telling you a lot about the statistics and the data, as well as the stories of the ways in which not only that statistically we're headed to, within sight, a couple of decades away from being a majority people of color country, but the fact is that that day has already arrived among new births, right? That among the newest of Americans, we are a majority people of color nation already. And when you have that combination of trends, inequality, a scarcity mindset, and a shift in the population that starts making not just divides across generation, but divides across race and color, the same divides, you get where we are right now. You get the politics that we have today, a politics of backlash, a politics of scapegoating, a politics of blame casting, a politics of nativism, a politics of racism, and a politics of bigotry. You get that across the country right now. And so, to me, it's not so much a surprise that we have the politics we have in the United States, and again, not just nationally, but here in Kansas, you feel it acutely. It's not a surprise. It's actually a bit of a miracle that this kind of angry, xenophobic, nativist politics has not arrived sooner in the United States. And I think we who care about the health of the community, who care about the ways in which physical health and civic health are entwined, have to start being grown-ups about naming these trends and about telling the story of these trends, but also telling the story in a way that says, we face a choice right now as a people, right? My friend Ai-jen Poo, who is the founder of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which itself has catalyzed this campaign called Caring Across Generations, talks about this silver tsunami that we are experiencing here, and that is, of course, the aging of the American population. But because her work is in organizing and activating domestic workers, a workforce that is primarily women of color, primarily immigrant women of color, caring for a population that is far more white, she sees firsthand, and her members see firsthand the ways in which this divide, this overlapping divide of a generation gap and a race and identity gap create, again, a simple binary choice. Are we going to engage each other and build a culture of caring in which we see our fates as entwined with one another? Or are we going to succumb to zero-sum, us versus them thinking? Right? Now, just from a standpoint of pure self-interest, you would think that older white Americans who know that their care will be provided by immigrant women of color or people of color in this country, just from a standpoint of simple self-interest, you'd think that that aging white population would say, okay, I think we've got to do more to include younger people of color into our civic institutions. We've got to do more to make sure that this rising workforce, who will be caring for me in my old age, is going to feel like they're part of the community and part of the society, right? But I think that fact alone is a good reminder of what politics is. And politics is irrational, not rational, right? Rationally, you would think, yes, as a matter of self-interest, that would make sense. But politics is irrational because humans are irrational, right? We are powered more by fear than we are by love in politics, and we are powered more by fear of the unknown than what we can actually see and calculate to be known and beneficial. And so again, those of us in this room who know a little bit better, who have both the tools when it comes to quantification and the heart when it comes to storytelling and being able to connect with people, we have a special obligation to frame this choice in a way that is going to help people build a more beloved community and a more perfect union. In our work at Citizen University, we've been going all around the United States over the last few years to try to do this. And the sense of urgency that we feel right now is really high. And you know, I think we've benefited over the last couple of years from a heightened interest in all things civic engagement, civic participation. You know, I sometimes joke a little bit ruefully, and it's really a joke, that the end of the Republic has been great for business for us at Citizen University. The sense that our institutions are crumbling and our democracy is under assault from outside and from within has made a lot of people step up and wake up and realize, oh, we should pay attention to civics. We should pay attention to civic health, pay attention to civic power. And we're happy to get the increased attention. But quite frankly, this crisis did not come upon us overnight. It did not arrive 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Right? This is a crisis that is 40 years in the making, under Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, under Republican governors in this state, Democratic governors in this state. This is a crisis in which, over 4 decades, policy choices, narrative and ideology choices, stories about who we are and what we do, have made it possible for a smaller and smaller number of us to hoard more and more of the opportunity in this society. And so I don't know that it's going to take us 3 or 4 decades to unwind it. I'm not sure that we have 3 or 4 decades to unwind it. But it certainly isn't going to be overnight that we fix this. And in our work at Citizen University, we've been going all around the United States, inviting people. I think that verb is really central here, inviting people to be part of the solution and to be part of the news story. And what I wanted to share with you today, actually, are just, 6 strategies that we've learned over these years that have to do with how we actually build a bigger sense of a more beloved community and help us navigate this passage that we're in right now and make this choice as a society. So the first strategy that we really focus on is simply teaching power. You've heard me talk a lot about power. You've heard that the title of my new book is You're More Powerful Than You Think. And I think this idea of teaching power is really important because the word power, the idea of power, is something that a lot of Americans are reflexively allergic to. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to name it. It seems a little bit dirty to go there because if you talk about power, you're going to talk about power imbalances, and that's going to make somebody unhappy. Many of you in this room are on the positive side, the long end of the stick of many power imbalances. And so it seems like to even bring up the topic seems like you're rubbing it in, right? But a big part of our message is that if you have any qualms about naming power, talking about power, you've got to get over that right now. Because in this age of severe radical inequality, it's all about our willingness to talk about the ways in which power has been concentrated. And that the promise of this republic is the idea that we are that the republic itself, like the body, is a complex adaptive system that is capable of correcting itself, that is capable of remedying deep radical imbalances of power. Right? But the only way you get there is if you actually name it. And so when I talk about power, I mean something very simple, which is a capacity to ensure that others do as you would like them to do. Now, that too sounds very icky to a lot of people. But let's be honest, in every sphere of our lives, whether our personal lives, our neighborhood lives, our faith lives, our civic lives, we're always trying to get others to do as we would like them to do. Those of you who are working on anti-smoking campaigns are trying to get other people to do as you would like them to do, right? The only question is whether you are being candid about naming the objective and then whether you're being literate in the forms and the methods of actually moving others to do what you would like them to do. Power is a literacy, as surely as reading and writing is a literacy. Understanding the sources of power, money power, people power, ideas power, the power of social norms, the power of state action, the power of violence. Right? These sources of power that are coursing all through our society at all times. If you see them, you see them. If you don't see them, you're sort of just operating with a very limited toolkit. Right? Being able not only to see those sources and being able not only to read a map of power, but then being able to write and rewrite that map of power. And to understand that in any map of power, if you were to actually draw a map of your county or of this state, right, or your town or your workplace, and draw a map of power, that map would probably only bear passing resemblance to the official org chart. Right? The map of power in the state is not just governor, lieutenant governor, Senate majority leader, whatever. Right? The map of power in the state includes Boeing. The map of power in the state includes the Koch brothers. The map of power in the state includes the Kansas Health Foundation. The map of power includes many people who are the people you are trying to serve who have not yet discovered their voice and discovered their capacity, but who in fact outnumber plenty who have. Right? If you were to draw that map of power, you would see with new eyes what it is that you're butting up against every day. But then the work of actually trying to rewrite that map of power requires you to focus in on one very specific question. And that this question is at the heart of all civic power, and this is this. Who decides? Who decides? Right? And so to teach power means everywhere you go to help people understand who decides. Now, you all have been living a very, I know, frustrating and years-long case study on Medicaid expansion. And so everybody in this room is quite literate in who decides on that, right? You came within a vote last session of deciding one way, and this year it didn't come that close for a variety of other cross-currents and other reasons, I know. But the question of who decides, right? And again, you can answer that question in an org chart way. Well, the governor decides, and if the governor vetoes, then the legislature decides if they can muster enough of an overriding majority. But I think that's only the org chart official way to look at it, right? Because the real way to answer that question, who decides, is we decide. We who support Medicaid expansion had been able last time and are going to be able next time to mobilize enough people to make their voice heard to their legislators to say, this is not a party issue. This is not an ideology issue. This is a what's smart, what's good, what's wise, what's a long-term investment for us issue, right? If enough people can be awakened to do that, then the focal point of decision will have shifted. But this literacy in power turns on this question of who decides. And the way that I've been putting it, this kind of the org chart way of describing it and the real way of describing it, when you think about civics classes, which don't really exist anymore, and that is part of the 40-year decline in our country, of our democracy, that civics got sort of swallowed by social studies, which in turn got swallowed by testable subjects like math and reading. Right? So our kids don't learn civics per se anymore. But to the extent that you have civics classes, and those of you who took civics classes used to remember that civics used to be how a bill becomes a law. Right? And everybody here can tell a painful, frustrating, no BS story of how, in the case of Medicaid expansion, a bill didn't become a law. And that story would not just be about committee chairs and votes and caucuses and vetoes. It would be a story about what business communities, what faith communities, what organizations of immigrants or communities of color did or did not muster enough power at what time. Right? So teaching power is one core strategy that I feel like we've all got to get comfortable doing. And in this book, which I didn't want, some of you I've gotten to meet over the last couple of years at other gatherings here in Kansas, or at a gathering like this in Colorado last summer. And I didn't want to just do the same old book talk that I've been doing. And so later on during Q&A, I can tell you a bit of kind of what's in the book for those of you who aren't super familiar with it. But I did want to name this idea in particular, that teaching power is your responsibility, is our responsibility. Right? That every one of us is a civics teacher. Every one of us. And the world around us, the towns around us, the small towns and the big cities around us are our civics classrooms. Right? And so, in the Marine Corps, the United States Marine Corps teaches people that they have a saying, every Marine a rifleman, which means whether you're a cook, a tank driver, a pilot, or an infantry officer, you have to have basic marksmanship. You need to be able to handle a rifle and be able to use it properly. Right? I would say, in our context, every health professional, every person who cares about public health is a civics teacher. You've got to be thinking about in every single encounter you deal with, whether it's with peers in the health industry, whether it's with policymakers, whether it's with everyday folks, whether it's with people from outside the state, that you are finding an opportunity to teach power. To help people read that map of power and to imagine how they might rewrite that map. So that's number one. Number two, was very coupled with this teaching of power, is the teaching of character. Now, I know that the word character, like the word power, kicks up a lot of associations, and some of them are, again, make people kind of a little standoffish, right? Because character, over the last generation, there's been a lot of talk in education, for instance, of character education. A lot of talk of character in terms of individual virtue. And I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about individual virtues like perseverance or diligence or grit. Those matter, and those are important. And nor am I certainly talking about kind of the ways in which, a generation ago, guys like Bill Bennett started writing books about character, and books like the Books of Virtues, and started being kind of proselytizers and moralizers about character until such times as it found out that he was a compulsive gambler and then lost all of his moral standing to be a preacher on virtue. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something different, which is what I conceive of as character in the collective. How we live together. Pro-social virtues of service, of sharing of sacrifice, of reciprocity, of mutual aid. There's an element to the work that all of us do that, as I say, is not just intellectual, is not just analytical, but is at the heart. And the heart isn't just about emotion. The heart is about values. Right? The heart is about sensing that there is no such thing as a self-made man or woman. The heart senses and knows that we're all better off when we're all better off. And yet our politics and our culture in an age of scarcity pushes us the other way. Right? The messages of our culture are every man for himself. The messages of the marketplace are get yours while you can. Once you got it, hoard it. Right? But the messages of our heart, which for many of you are translated into messages of faith traditions, and for others of you will be translated simply into the messages of caregiving, providing care, creating structures and systems of care. Recognize that care is not mere charity. Care is not a matter of self-sacrificing altruism. Care is self-interest properly understood. When that pinky's sitting there with 25% of my blood supply, thinking it's doing great, it will come to realize after a while that as robust and flush as it feels, that when the rest of the body to which it is inextricably bound starts to fail and the organs shut down and the rest of it can't breathe, that it too will die. Right? And to teach character is to remind people of what the heart knows. And I know this is, again, for those of you who are very data-minded and very practical, this may seem a little bit squishy. It is. It is. Because remember, like what I said earlier, people are irrational. People are squishy. People are moved by things that are not about stats and facts. Right? And so our ability to teach character in the same way that when you go out there teaching power, being a civics teacher and explaining to folks at every scale who decides and how that came to happen, part of that story you've got to tell is a story of the value set that surrounded that decision, of the moral frame that people carried with them, right? The moral narrative that people had in an unnamed way oftentimes in their own hearts. So teaching character is something that, again, when I say that phrase, you might think of, like scouts or rites of passage like confirmation or bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah or something. I'm not talking about adults teaching children. I'm not talking primarily about that. I mean all of us teaching all of us. And remembering that that's got to be part of the way that you do your work, to go there on the values level, even if it seems a little bit squishy, a little bit hokey, to go there and to try injecting this language that says we're all better off when we're all better off. Try injecting that, not only as a matter of kind of niceness, but as a matter of this is how we will thrive and survive together. In Seattle, I was blessed to be one of the members of a group, steering committee in town that our mayor appointed to raise our city's minimum wage. We became, as some of you may know, the first large city in the United States to implement a $15 minimum wage. And the way we got there, and the story we told, was not just a story of niceness and charity and compassion. Right? It was not just, hey, there are a lot of folks who can't make ends meet, let's be nicer to them. Right? That was part of it, of course, because that's a part of the human heart as well. But what got us over the hump, even in, as I said, blue and liberalist city as Seattle, what got us over the hump was telling a story that we're all better off when we're all better off. Telling a story that said, when folks who make $7 or $8 or $9 an hour start making $11, $13, $15 an hour, what do you think they do with that hourly surplus? You think they say, great, I'm going to just take this additional $3 or $4 an hour I'm getting, I'm going to park this in my account in the Cayman Islands, right? I'm going to invest this in, bonds and stocks and, get great capital gains on this. No, they spend it. They spend it on the dinner that they couldn't afford to take their spouse out for their anniversary. They spend it on the clothes they couldn't afford to get their kids for the start of the school year. They spend it on actually making rent on time this month. They spend it on what it actually costs to pay for a bus pass instead of every other time having to look the bus driver in the eye and say, come on, will you let me on? Right? They spend it. And so, to put it simply, when workers have more money, businesses have more customers. The florist, the restaurant, the clothes store, all these places suddenly start selling more stuff, and you set in motion an increasing cycle of rising demand, right? And so the other part of the story for why we were wanting to raise the minimum wage wasn't just because it's nice and because people are hurting, but also because it would be great for business. And that version of the story got people over the hump, right? And that is, again, not just an appeal to selfishness. It is a sense and a reminder that we're all better off when we're all better off, that we will thrive together. And that if you think that you can just thrive over here and cabin yourself off and wall off your fate from the fate of others, there is no wall high enough. That will not happen. Right? So we've got to do that in the way that we work, the way that we speak, the way that we move among our fellow citizens. Well, this brings me to the third strategy, which is a strategy of telling a bigger story of us. When I talk about this narrative that's implied in we're all better off and we're all better off, a story of us is really important. The great community organizer, Marshall Gans, who spent a life organizing farm workers, low-income workers, immigrants, others, all around the United States. He had a hand in organizing young volunteers here in Kansas and elsewhere for candidate Barack Obama, 2007 and 2008. Marshall Gans has a very simple formula for community organizing in which he talks about three nested stories: a story of self, a story of us, and a story of now. Right? So a good community organizer, an effective community organizer, is able to thread a through line between all three of those stories. To be able to say, here's a story of self. Here's who I am. Here's who you are right now. Right? If one of you going to your neighbors or to other folks who you want to try to activate and organize saying, here's a story of me. I'm a Kansan. I'm an X-generation Kansan. Or I just got to Kansas 3 months ago. Whatever. Right? But I am rooted in this vision of what Kansas can be. Right? I was shaped this way by my parents who homesteaded this territory, by my parents who were immigrants, by my parents who I never knew, whatever. Right? But that story of self is where it begins authentically. And then from that, you go to a story of us. Who are we meant to be? What are the ways in which this community of us, and that us can be Wichita, that us can be Topeka, that us can be Lawrence, or it can be Kansas, it can be the United States, right? A story of us. And then, of course, this idea of a story of now, which says that there is a, as Dr. King said, a fierce urgency of now. Right? And so actually, both candidate Barack Obama and candidate Donald Trump were very effective at doing these three stories together. Right? Candidate Obama, I'm a Kenyan Kansan. Right? I embody in my blood the diversity, the division, the promise, the peril of this country. I've lived that all my life. I've navigated all my life. That's the story of self. The story of us. Well, we're at a place right now in the country where we face those divisions. We face those opportunities. We have to decide whether this is a doubling or a dividing to have this kind of heritage as a country. Right? And then the story of now for candidate Obama was, we can't put it off anymore. For just the same reasons I was saying at the beginning, these shifts, these pressures, these tectonic changes in our demography and in our economy are forcing us to face whether we're going to be a country that is just still defined by the older white men who have always defined things, or is going to be more capacious and inclusive. We have to decide that. Right? That's what candidate Obama did incredibly effectively. Candidate Trump did the same thing. A story of self, that I'm a rule breaker, I'm an unconventional guy who has always won. I always win. Right? And I win by not playing the game as it is handed to me. I win by kicking over the game table and saying, I got a better game, and you're going to play my game. That was Donald Trump's story of self, built over a career of celebrity and a career of notoriety. Right? When you tell that kind of story, there's no notoriety that can hurt him. It's all part of the kicking over the table. Right? But then his story of us was, we're at a place as a country right now where the game has been so rigged and the system has been so completely corrupted that you can't just have your usual politician, no matter how well qualified, no matter how possibly path-breaking. You can't just have somebody who comes from the very establishment that rigged this game. You need somebody who's radically going to knock things over. We are ready for someone who's radically going to knock something over. And then his story of now was, and we can't waste another minute. That this is a crucial moment. And that if we choose the wrong fork right now, either America is going to be great again or it's not. Right? Now again, whether you like Obama's version or you like Trump's version, you have to say both of them were effective. Both of them were really good at telling a bigger story of us. Right? And I think this idea of a bigger story of us is something that is central to the work of being a civic catalyst. It is central to repairing the body politic. Again, let's go back to Medicaid expansion. Right? And I hope those of you who, I hope you do not feel frustrated or down because it hasn't happened yet, right? I hope you see that this is, this is part of a medium to long-term game that you will win. You will win, right? And everything worth fighting for in the life of this country, suffrage, right? Heck, last week, the 37th state of the Union ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, right? Which was left for dead in 1972, right? We're one state away from actually ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment in this country. And it's taken over a generation to get there. Now, I don't think it's going to take you a generation to expand Medicaid. But I think it is going to take this repeated push of telling a bigger story of us, right? Because what makes too many people resist Medicaid expansion, and again, perversely, many of the people who would benefit from Medicaid expansion, what makes too many people resist is that they think it's for them. It's for a racialized them. It's for an urbanized them. It's for a certain them. And what we've got to be able to do is tell a story of how this is for us, not just us because you might in fact be a beneficiary of Medicaid expansion, but us because, again, we're all better off when we're all better off. Us because what it means to stand for Kansas values is not every man for himself, right? This is a state that knows better than any place else on the planet that rugged individualism never got a barn raised. Rugged individualism never got a farm plotted or tiled. Rugged individualism is never sufficient. That it is about collective action and our collective fates. We're 2 days after the 74th anniversary of D-Day, which was, for me, probably the highlight of my time working for President Clinton was the 50th anniversary of D-Day. I got to help work on the speeches for President Clinton that he delivered to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And to do that work, I had to go and do all of this research, not only on D-Day and not only interviewing veterans of the Allied invasion of Normandy and to recognize all the ways in which that day, that battle, was this pivot point in the world's history. Part of that research I remember was reading about Dwight D. Eisenhower of Abilene and how on the night of June 5th, which was the kind of second time they'd gotten all the paratroopers and everybody ready to begin the invasion. They'd gotten everybody up and going for an invasion on June 5th, but then the clouds came in. But the night of June 5th to 6th was supposed to be a clear night. So on that night, they had to load up all the airborne paratroopers who were going to be the pathfinders, the first ones to drop into France and literally light the way for others, right? And so that evening, after they'd given them a nice, somewhat ominous meal of ice cream and everything they could ask for, all those paratroopers loaded up with 100-pound packs, standing there about to load their aircraft. And Dwight D. Eisenhower is just kind of making small talk with them and giving them encouragement. And one of the stories that stuck with me so vividly from that time was when he came up to this one group of paratroopers and he struck up a conversation with one of them. He said, "Where are you from, young man?" And it turned out that this young man was from Kansas. I don't remember where. I don't think it was Abilene also, but he was from Kansas. And Eisenhower spoke to him, and he nodded, and he talked about it. And as he kind of finished talking to this troop of paratroopers, he looked at that one guy in the eye, and he said, "Go get him, Kansas." I'm not from Kansas, but that gave me goosebumps when I read that. I got goosebumps just telling you that right now. Right? Go get him, Kansas. Right? When you have a little phrase like that, uttered by Dwight D. Eisenhower 74 years ago in a couple of days, "Go get him, Kansas," what he's not saying is, "You're on your own, buddy." What he was not saying was, "I hope when you land you figure it out because no one's going to help you and you're not part of a larger group or a unit." He was not saying to him, "We're dropping 100 different paratroopers from this plane to 100 different places to each pursue 100 different plans." No. What he was saying was, remember everything you know about being a Kansan. Remember everything you are about being a Kansan, which is the way that you pull together in crisis, which is the way that you've navigated hard times, which is the way that you have faced the moral challenges of our time, even when it meant that this had to be a bloody, bleeding state. That part of Kansas and that part of your history and heritage and the ways in which you live together as a people, making farms, building cities, including people, pulling together, right? That's a bigger story of us. We've got to remember how to tell that story, not in grand narratives, but even in the smallest little ways of go get 'em, Kansas. Right? Well, that brings me to my next strategy that I want to talk about, which is a strategy simply of joy, practicing joy. Now, you might think, boy, Eric, you've been talking pretty, telling a pretty grim story about, 25-pound pinkies and the body's dying and collapsing and our society's cratering and fracturing and, internal civil war and all this stuff. What are you pivoting to joy for, right? And here's why I'm pivoting to joy. Because I believe, actually, I didn't know you all were making these cool signs here. But we believe at Citizen University that the way that we have to tell a story about why people should show up, why people should engage and participate, why people should vote, for instance, right, is not just a story of eat your vegetables, right? And again, right, you're in the health business. You do want people to eat their vegetables. But you know better than most that when you tell people to eat their vegetables, you will have a pretty low return rate, right? When you wag your finger at them and say, do your duty, eat your vegetables. People are watching, right? It's good for you. There's some percentage of folks who will respond to that, but there's a much larger percentage who will be left cold by that. And what we found in our work at Citizen University is that there's got to be a different invitation besides eat your vegetables. And that different invitation has to be join the party. Be part of something joyful. We launched 2 years ago with the Knight Foundation a project called The Joy of Voting. And the premise of this project was that in all over the United States, as voting rates have been declining, as voter participation has been flat or declining, that there's been a couple of misconceptions about why voting matters. And one of the things that we came to see was that there was no amount of telling people to vote just as a eat your vegetables kind of message that was going to work. What we had to do was to actually rekindle a thing that used to exist in this country. Right? For much of this country's history, up until about the advent of television, there was a culture of joyful, raucous, participatory engagement around voting in elections. Street theater, open-air debates, dueling parades, festivals, bonfires. Right? Actually, last night I got to town around 7 o'clock and heard this loud music outside, and I asked the guy at the front desk, what's going on? He said, oh, there's this River Fest going on. And so I dropped my stuff off, and I just walked, paid my $10 for a button, and spent an hour and a half just walking through River Fest, right? River Fest is great. It's fun, right? Dude on a 3-story tall unicycle, college students on tricycle races, great music and bands and all kinds of, from a health perspective, it's a disaster zone, right? I mean, it's, but come on, okay? I was not there to tell anybody to eat their vegetables, right? But if you did go there and you said, eat your funnel cake, but vote, right? Register to vote while you have that fried chicken on a stick, right? Then people would have said, okay, yeah, like this is part of what it means to have fun and to kind of be laughing here as the guy in the unicycle is kind of telling jokes and making a show out of the whole thing. And so, throughout our country's history, there was this culture, and it was a very locally rooted kind of culture, right? Sometimes it was tradesmen's groups organizing the parades and bonfires and festivals. Sometimes it was immigrant and ethnic groups. Sometimes it was, when we got into the age of suffrage, it was suffragists and others. But in all of this work, it was the idea that the message was not eat your vegetables, it was join the party, right? Join the club. And so we started this project out of this premise. This grew out of an article I wrote for The Atlantic saying, you know what? There's really no good reason why we couldn't revive that culture. of joyful voting. We just have to prime the pump again. And so the Knight Foundation agreed, and they've worked with us over the last few years in 7 cities now across the United States to gather up in every community. Wichita is actually one of the first 4. Wichita, Akron, Philly, Miami, St. Paul, Grand Forks, Charlotte, Tallahassee, actually more than 7 now. And in all these places, we would organize and invite artists, activists, musicians, designers, active citizens, not active citizens, to come brainstorm ideas. Or what is a simple project that you or your friends or your kids or your peers might want to create to kindle this culture of joyful voting? And then we had all these micro grants, up to $3,500, $3,600 to make these projects happen. We've been seeding these projects all around the United States. In Wichita, it's been great. We've had great partners, projects like Vote Like a Mother, some of you may have heard of. Becky's been part of and catalyzing. Projects were in the North End. There were kind of mixtape and graffiti making sessions that were all about getting folks to participate in the electoral process. Artists engaged to create great ICT stickers. I voted ICT stickers, and a kind of a competition and a vote for what was the favorite sticker and coolest sticker. All these kinds of things. and the method of this has been a very simple method, right? When you invite people with joy, people respond. When you invite people to activate their creativity, people respond. When you invite people to imagine themselves as part of the story, as authors of the story, as creators of the story, as painters of the mural, they respond. Right? And so when I talk about joy, I don't mean in some kind of naive Pollyanna way like, oh, yay, let's all be happy while inequality rages through and racial division kind of ravages our community, right? I don't mean just kind of a naive cheerfulness. I mean recognizing that, especially in times as dark and foreboding as these, people hunger for joy. People hunger for a reason to believe in something affirmative and not just something to resist or something to oppose. Right? Joy matters. We've got to practice joy and spread joy in that way and think about ways in which, in all of our work, we are giving people an invitation to joy. Well, then the next strategy, the 5th one I want to tell you about, relates to this, and this is a strategy that I simply call start a club. So one of the people I talk about in my book, who I think is still one of the greatest practitioners of civic power ever, was Benjamin Franklin. Ben Franklin was this, we all know Ben Franklin as, for all the ways we know him as a founder, but what he was fundamentally, kind of in his DNA, was this inveterate, relentless club maker. The guy was addicted to making clubs. Philosophical clubs, scientific clubs, tradesmen's groups, right? Neighborhood clubs. He started the first subscription library, the first volunteer fire department in the early country, right? Just making clubs all the time. And the thing about making a club is that it activates everything I'm talking about here, right? If you think about power and creativity and imagination and hope, all these elements of what you think of as a healthy body politic, right? They're just sitting there right now, like iron filings on a tray. Starting a club is like the magnet, and boom, all those iron filings kind of come together, right? Or if you want to use a different, more scientific metaphor, all those things, joy and purpose and hope and wanting to be part of something bigger than yourself, those are like little amino acids floating around in the primordial soup, right? Little protein chains sitting there. Starting a club is the lightning bolt that actually makes some of those chains connect. And all of a sudden, you get RNA, and you get DNA, and you have life, right, out of that primordial soup. Starting a club, inviting people on any topic. I'm not just talking about civic clubs or political clubs, right? We Americans, over the last 40 years, that same period, most of our lifetimes, have, this is a period of time where my friend Annie Leonard, who runs Greenpeace USA, often talks about this. Over these last 4 decades, we as Americans have built giant, overdeveloped consumer muscles, while our citizen muscles have atrophied to a pitiful, pitiful state. Right? As consumers, we know 20 different brands of toothpaste. We know different ways to price different things. We know how to get the best deal on a new car or a used car. We understand how to shop, how to buy. But as citizens, we don't know a thing, right? Because we've stopped exercising that muscle and starting a club, inviting 2 or 3 other people in some common endeavor, requiring a common goal, requiring a common agenda, requiring you to negotiate among yourselves about what your common priorities ought to be. And that club can be about stamp collecting, it can be about gardening, it can be about baseball, it can be about World War II buffs, or it can be about organizing poor people to fight for Medicaid expansion. Or it can be about organizing white allies for Black Lives Matter. Or it can be about, as my friend Mark Meckler did, the co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots, about organizing people who have been on the sidelines of politics and are frustrated at the size and scale of the federal government and decide, no more. I'm showing up at town meetings. I'm getting involved. Right? I've never done a thing like this in my life, but I know there are other people who are as ticked off as I am. Mark, before the Tea Party became the Tea Party, all he had was an instinct to start a club. It started with a few people face to face, and then that club turned into something that was big conference calls, and then it was bigger rallies, and then internet, and so forth. But it was all that same Franklin-esque instinct of, I want to make a club. Right? I want to have a club where people have a sense of shared purpose, have a sense of shared language, have some joyful rituals, have some things that we do together, break bread. Franklin's clubs always involved, brew pubs and beer and the rest, right? Have a drink. Start a club. Right? And that muscle, starting clubs, is, as I say, it spans from the completely non-political to the very political. One of the things that right now, if you think about the way in which the Tea Party arose, but you think about today, in the last 18 months, the way that Indivisible has emerged out of thin air. This organization that began as a 20-page Google document written by 4 former Democratic congressional staffers. It was this document that was kind of talk about how to read and write power. It was a 20-page document about how you as a citizen can apply jujitsu pressure on your member of Congress. Make your member of Congress buckle under your pressure. Right? Not just write a letter to your member, or not just call this number at the congressperson's office, but go to this person in their office. Show up at this kind of town hall. Organize this kind of message. Right? They published this 20-page Google document, and then just like that, in ways that they did hope for, the document went viral. People all around the country started sharing and spreading this document as the Trump administration got underway to say, okay, we've got to start applying pressure on Congress to do its constitutional duty, and provide checks and balances in the workings of our federal government, right? And so that document went viral, and that's what the co-creators of the document had hoped for. But what happened next, they had no expectation for, no plan for, and that is that people started self-organizing using that document, and they started making clubs. People in Wichita started saying, you know what? Like, this is a great document. Why don't, let's get a few friends together at the library or after church or whatever, and let's talk about this document. And let's talk about, okay, what are we going to do to show up at our member of Congress's town hall? What are we going to do to show up at the Capitol when it comes time for this issue or that issue? What are we going to do? Right? There are now over 7,000 indivisible chapters that have completely sprouted up in a self-organized way, clubs that people have formed without permission, without anybody telling them to do it, but just because that document captured something and people said, I want to make a club, and they invited each other. Right? Indivisible was the name of the document, and now is the name of the movement. And so whether you are a Tea Party adherent or you are an Indivisible adherent, whether you think about this administration and what's going on right now as something to cheer and to advance and to push and accelerate, or something to resist and to slow down, the instinct to start a club is central. And to bring it back to the work of the state, if you think about the debates that you've been having in Kansas, right? Kansas turns out to be one of the country's great case studies. You have run a very interesting experiment here over the last few years. You know, Louis Brandeis talked about the states as laboratories of democracy. You all had a laboratory, and you had kind of mad scientists cooking up kind of unchecked tax cuts. And let's see what happens when we have an agenda of unchecked tax cuts and slashing government, slashing funding in education, slashing funding in healthcare. Let's see what happens. And, well, when your laboratory room kind of blew up, the rest of the country saw, wow, okay, interesting experiment. Let's maybe not go there, right? And I don't mean that I don't mean to be glib, right? And nor do I mean to be partisan. I think there are Republican leaders in the state who understand and who admit today that that was an experiment gone haywire. And that, you know, part of the reason why you didn't get Medicaid expansion this year was that the state finally decided to live up to its obligations to fund education, right? But there too, this idea that it's not just a zero-sum thing. But in any case, in this kind of work, what's been able to drive this shift, both the experiment itself and then the kind of counter to the experiment, the containing of it, and the decision to actually start governing like grown-ups here in Kansas, has been fostered by everyday citizens like you forming clubs, making clubs. This brings me to the sixth and the final strategy that I want to share with you. And that is to kindle purpose. Purpose. I want to close with this one because I think this is really important, right? When I say purpose, I don't mean, it's connected to joy, it's connected to narratives of who is us, but it's different. One of the things that we've been doing at Citizen University over the last couple of years is we've started doing these gatherings. We started in Seattle, and now they're spreading all around the United States, called Civic Saturdays. Civic Saturdays are these regular gatherings that are basically a civic analog to church. It's not church, it's not mosque or temple or synagogue or anything, but it is about this idea that there is an American civic religion. That our creed as Americans is a creed worth living up to, worth treating seriously, worth practicing. And it is a creed of liberty, of equal justice under law, a creed of the people are sovereign, a creed that no man is above the law, a creed that says a republic is not a thing that is handed to us and then runs in a self-perpetuating way like some kind of perpetual motion machine, a creed that says a democracy is a garden, and gardens require gardeners. To be a citizen of a republic is to keep the republic, which means to tend the garden. Right? And that creed, that set of values, that set of ethics, some of which is founded, yes, in our kind of foundational documents, in the Declaration, in the preamble to the Constitution, some of which are found in other texts that you might find throughout our history. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Susan B. Anthony's speech at her trial for the crime of attempting to vote. Ronald Reagan's speech at the Berlin Wall. Right? There are these foundational texts that express the heart of what it means to actually be an American at the creedal level. And it is a reminder that to be an American is not a matter of bloodline. It is not a matter of, as today's nativists like to say, blood and soil. It is a matter of adherence to a creed. Right? And I, as the son of immigrants, I was reminded many times in many ways, never explicitly, but just in the kind of implicit messages of my household, my family, that all I had done was to have the dumb luck to be born here. Right? My parents had done the heavy lifting, being born in China during the wars, during the Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War and Chinese Civil War. They'd done the heavy lifting to come to the United States. I just had the dumb luck to be born here. And so the question that was always implicit in the air was, what am I going to do to earn it? What am I going to do to live up to this creed, to claim this creed? Right? And so Civic Saturdays are these gatherings that are about this notion that there is an American civic religion, as Alexis de Tocqueville spoke of. Right? When Tocqueville came to the young United States in the 1830s, and he went to small towns, north and south, east and west, he was struck not just by the industry and the kind of busyness of Americans, he was struck by how this place, unlike any place in France or the rest of Europe, was held together by this invisible web of relationship and obligation, this invisible sense of shared purpose, this invisible sense of civic spirit. Right? So at Civic Saturdays, we have these gatherings that follow the arc of a faith gathering. We come together, we sing together, we turn to the stranger next to us, and we talk about a common prompt or a question. There are readings of texts of the kinds that I was citing earlier that you might think of as civic scripture. If it's in Seattle, I give a sermon. If it's not in Seattle, someone else gives a sermon. Right? We sing some more, and then after that, instead of kind of tea and cookies or whatever, we actually have circles of more discussion or circles of organizing or activism around homelessness, around healthcare, around gun violence, whatever it might be. Right? And when we started these in Seattle in late 2016, we thought, you know, it'd be great if a couple dozen people showed up. This is kind of a weird thing. It's kind of a ritual that doesn't exist. The very first one we called, over 250 people came and crammed this basement of a bookstore. Right? It felt like the underground. And then every time after that, we realized, okay, every time after that, we've had between 150 and more people showing up to these for a couple hours on a Saturday morning. And then we realized, okay, we are onto something here. And then as word of this got around in the media and elsewhere, people from other parts of the country started asking, hey, can you come bring Civic Saturday to us? And to a certain extent, we said, sure, we'd love to. And so we've been taking Civic Saturdays to Des Moines and Nashville, and we'll be in Atlanta in a couple of weeks, and New York and LA and Oakland and other places, Detroit. But that's not scalable, right? And so what we decided to do instead was to start a civic seminary. So this year, we've launched with 2 cohorts of 12 people each, so 24 people this year. Next year, we hope to quadruple that. And the civic seminary is just a half-week, intensive, immersive experience. We bring folks to Seattle, and we steep them in everything you do. We steep them in notions of civic health, in the health of the body politic. We steep them in notions of civic religion and this creed that we are all trustees of and inheritors to. We steep them in the values and the language of citizenship and self-interest properly understood. Right? We steep them in the elements of practicing power. We teach them how to hold the space that one needs to hold in running a Civic Saturday. Right? And in doing this, we've learned from and put together and gotten examples from an incredible array of folks. Some of them, yes, from institutions of spiritual formation, whether divinity schools or seminaries, actual seminaries or others, but also from folks in the public health world, folks in the media world who are really good at creating narrative experiences, right? Folks from the arts world who are great at creating tapestries of common purpose through art. And we've been stitching together all of these strands of ways that you bring people together in purpose, a shared sense of purpose, a sense that I'm part of something greater than myself. There's a reason for me to be here that's not just about pursuing my purely selfish ends. And yes, many people find their sense of purpose through their faith lives, and we are saying that right alongside that in civic life, especially in this time right now, we've got to activate a sense of shared purpose to keep our republic, to save our country, to make sure that to remind ourselves in a very basic way, nobody's coming to save us. Right? Nobody's coming to save us. So our sense of purpose plus urgency right now has to be, am I ready to save us? And am I not alone in that readiness? This is the thing that we've got to remember right now. Right? When candidate Obama said to adoring rallies, right? Where was that? In Osawatomie, Kansas, or wherever he did one of his early rallies, right? That huge, huge rally of young people. And he said, "We are the change we've been waiting for," right? And everybody cheered, and everybody thought in their heads, "You are the change we've been waiting for." And he said, "No, no, no, we are the change we've been waiting for." And people kept looking at him and said, "Yeah, you, Barack Obama, you're the change we've been waiting for," right? We have to remember that candidate Obama was right. We still haven't lived up to the message of his campaign. Those of us like me who voted for him thought, great, here comes this once in a country's history unicorn of a candidate who is going to save us because he does embody all of our divisions and all of our contradictions. And he's going to save us because he's a decent, smart man. He didn't save us. We're more divided than ever. Our politics is still broken. Right? He made progress, but he didn't save us. Now, candidate Trump didn't come and say that we are the change. He actually came, I suppose, candidly and said, "I alone can fix this." But there, too, people believed him. People believe that he alone can fix this. And those who believe that and wanted to believe that are wrong also. Right? We've got to remember that we are the change we've been waiting for. And we are the authors of our common purpose. We've got to kindle that sense of common purpose in all of our work. I'll close with this note. I talked about Dwight D. Eisenhower. I talked about Go Get 'em, Kansas. You know, I went back 4 years ago for the 70th anniversary. I went back with my speechwriting colleague and our wives for the 70th anniversary commemoration. And of course, there are fewer living veterans of D-Day. You know, it's with every year that number dwindles. But I remember that one of the lines that I'm most proud of in the speech that I wrote for President Clinton was this line where he was looking at the surviving veterans of D-Day who were sitting in the first few rows in front of them. And he said of them, their ranks are growing thinner, and they may walk with a little less spring in their step. But let us never forget, when they were young, these men saved the world. Right? When he said that line, these men were all tough old guys. Many of them had kind of jammed themselves back into their uniforms, even though they were in their 70s at that age and everything. They're sitting there, and they were tough, and they were stoic. They were part of that greatest generation that didn't like to talk about this stuff, certainly didn't like to brag about this stuff, right? When President Clinton said to them and looked at them and said, when they were young, these men saved the world, I looked over at that row of those first two rows, and I saw those men start to quake and shake because they were crying, right? And they were crying. And then I looked at them, and I looked at my fellow speechwriter, Jeremy, and we just started bawling, right? Like, we couldn't contain it. Like, the floodgates just opened, right? And that feeling of they were crying because they knew that sense of common purpose then. Right? They knew no one was going to save them. They knew they were the change they were waiting for. They knew that when they got dropped in as paratroopers to all kinds of wrong places, completely off plan, that they had to figure it out by twos and threes. They knew that when their landing craft came in on Omaha Beach, in the wrong places, without any of the cover that they'd hoped for, and that all the German guns were still in place, just mowing them down, they knew that just staying there and hiding behind the structures and hiding behind the bodies of their fallen comrades was not going to cut it. That by twos and threes and fives and tens, they had to rekindle the habits of sandlot baseball, of church on Sunday, of barn raisings, of people looking out for each other, of barbecues, of food drives. They had to rekindle those habits of common purpose and rekindle those habits of lifting themselves out of a moment where it seems like all is lost and actually deciding that I am going to be the hinge point of history. That's where we are right now. We are blessed to not have to storm a beach. We are blessed to not have a global menace like Nazism knocking on the door. But make no mistake, our world needs saving right now. Make no mistake, our country, our republic, is in a bad way. Right? All of you from all parts of Kansas are getting parachuted and dropped into different places, often the wrong place, often without the resources you thought you'd have, often without the equipment you thought you were promised. Right? You are entering into these zones feeling unprepared, unready, and you got to remember this. We are all we have. No one's going to save us. You got to remember this also. we are enough. We are enough. We are enough to get Medicaid expanded in this state. We are enough to make sure that this country does not devolve into a tyranny of trickle-down economics of the kind that you all experimented with. We are enough to recognize that we are all better off when we're all better off. We are enough to create a new narrative of common purpose. We are enough to actually spread the knowledge and the practice of power and character in civic life in a way that can restore a sense of balance in our country. We are enough. We just have to remember to cheer each other, to challenge each other, and to change each other every single day in all the ways that we know how. If we do that, you're going to make Kansas a great beacon and a great experiment in another way, in a way that you want to be proud of. You're going to be able to show the rest of the country, here's what it looks like when a state that has lots of political division, lots of fear, lots of anxiety. Here's what it looks like when a state that is facing more acutely than many in the country is facing those demographic tectonic shifts of an older white population feeling loss, feeling their place in the pecking order has been kicked away. Here's what it looks like when a state where the Latino population is booming, the Asian population is booming, where there's a strong and proud and enduring African-American population, where all of these communities come together and say, we can actually create a new story of what it means to be Kansan. We can create a new story of what it means to look out for each other, what it means to practice power and character in a way that benefits all of us. You can show us the way. And when you do that, I will remember that I got to spend part of a morning with you as you learned and taught each other and reminded each other how to change Kansas and the world. Thank you very much.